In May of 326 BC, on the drenched, blood-soaked banks of the Hydaspes River, Alexander the Great stood at the edge of the known world facing an army built for sheer destruction. Across the monsoon-swollen waters, King Porus marshaled a force of over 35,000 men, 30,000 heavy infantry armed with 6-foot bamboo broadbows, 4,000 armored pyrrhic cavalry, 300 heavy war chariots, and a terrifying vanguard of 200 massive war elephants, living fortresses lined up edge to edge, their tusks tipped with iron spikes and their howdahs bristling with archers and javelin throwers. To break this living wall, Alexander held a total force of roughly 40,000 men along the river, but for his spearhead, he picked an elite strike team of 11,000 veterans. He fielded his invincible companion cavalry Hetairoi, mounted Dahae horse archers, elite Hyphaspes shield-bearers, deadly Agrianian light javelin throwers, and the impenetrable 18-foot sarissa-armed Macedonian phalanx. Yet Alexander's cavalry was completely useless. His horses panicked at the sight and roar of the elephants, refusing to step into the water. With a mile-wide churning river separating 11,000 Macedonian veterans from 35,000 Paurava warriors holding the high ground, a direct amphibious assault meant instant annihilation. This was the deadliest clash of Alexander's life. The Battle of the Hydaspes would push the Macedonian war machine past its absolute breaking point, unleashing a level of industrial violence so horrific that it would break the spirit of the world's greatest army, ending Alexander's dreams of reaching the Eastern Ocean. For weeks, the two kings engaged in a high-stakes psychological war across the swollen Jhelum River in modern-day Pakistan. King Porus, ruler of the Paurava kingdom, was a giant of a man, standing over 6.5 feet tall, clad in gilded steel armor and possessing an acute strategic mind. He deployed his forces along the eastern bank, mirroring Alexander's every move. Wherever Alexander marched his troops, Porus's war elephants were there, waiting at the water's edge. Alexander realized a direct amphibious assault was suicide. If his transports attempted a landing, the smell and terrifying trumpeting of the elephants would panic the horses, causing them to leap off the rafts and drown. So Alexander launched a masterclass in deception. Night after night, Macedonian troops staged fake crossings. They blew horns, beat drums, yelled battle cries, and marched up and down the western bank. At first, Porus marshaled his elephants and rushed to meet each threat. But after days of false alarms, the Indian king grew desensitized. He stopped moving his main force, leaving only outposts along the riverbank. Porus had taken the bait. While the main Macedonian camp under General Craterus kept up a massive, visible presence directly opposite Porus, Alexander was preparing his true stroke, a secret 17-mile flank march upstream. On a night when the sky tore open with torrential rain, lightning, and howling gales, Alexander moved. Under the cover of the violent monsoon, he led an elite striking force of 11,000 veteran infantry and cavalry upstream to a secluded, heavily wooded river bend near a small island. The storm was a double-edged sword. It masked the clatter of armor and the splash of oars, but the river was a churning death trap. Men and horses were swept away in the dark, fighting against raging currents to reach the opposite bank. When Alexander finally landed, disaster struck. The mainland he had landed on was actually a secondary island separated by another deep channel. Wading through chest-deep, rushing water under the flash of lightning, the Macedonians barely managed to claw their way to the true eastern shore. The alarm was raised. Learning that a Macedonian force had crossed, Porus sent his son, the young prince, with 2,000 cavalry and 120 heavy chariots to intercept them. It was a fatal miscalculation. The monsoon rains had turned the riverbank into a sea of thick, treacherous clay. The heavy Indian chariots sank to their axles, rendered entirely immovable. Alexander unleashed his elite horse archers and companion cavalry. The mobile Macedonian horsemen circled the bogged-down chariots, raining arrows and lances onto the trapped crews. The prince was slain, the chariots were captured or destroyed, and the survivors fled back to Porus with terrifying news. Alexander was across the river. Realizing Craterus was still across the river and Alexander was advancing on his flank, Porus chose a firm, sandy plain to make his stand. He drew up a terrifying defensive line. In the center stood 200 war elephants, spaced roughly 50 feet apart. with light infantry filling the gaps. Behind this living wall of leather and iron sat his heavy infantry phalanx. On his flanks, Porus posted his cavalry and remaining chariots. Alexander understood he could not charge his cavalry into those elephants. Instead, he deployed his trademark tactical genius. Alexander took the bulk of his companion cavalry and feigned an attack against Porus's left flank. Seeing Alexander's strike force, Porus began shifting his right-wing cavalry across his line to reinforce his left. This was the trap. Alexander had secretly dispatched his general Conus with a cavalry division around Porus's right flank, concealed by the terrain. As the Indian cavalry shifted, Conus swept in from behind them, trapping the Paurava horsemen in a deadly hammer and anvil strike. Porus's cavalry broke and scrambled for safety behind the war elephants. Then came the clash of infantry, one of the most brutal encounters in ancient warfare. Porus drove his war elephants forward. The massive beasts crashed into the Macedonian phalanx like battering rams. Men were trampled into pulp, tossed into the air, or crushed beneath giant feet. The sight was horrifying, trunks tearing soldiers apart, iron-tipped tusks impaling multiple men at once. For a moment, the invincible Macedonian line buckled, but these were veterans of Gaugamela and Tyre. Alexander's light infantry, the Agrianians and archers, stepped forward, targeting the Mahout elephant drivers with a hail of javelins and arrows. Left driverless, the beasts panicked. Macedonian phalangites armed themselves with special curved Kopides axes and scythes, stepping inside the reach of the tusks to chop at the trunks and hamstrings of the giant beasts. Terrified, wounded, and maddened by pain, the elephants lost all cohesion. They turned around and rampaged through their own densely packed infantry ranks, trampling Porus's men by the hundreds. The Macedonian phalanx locked their shields, formed a tight wall of pikes, and pushed the trapped Indian army into a tightening ring of steel. At that moment, General Craterus crossed the river with fresh troops, slamming into the exhausted, encircled Paurava forces from behind. The battle became a massacre. Amid the carnage, King Porus refused to flee. Mounted atop his massive prized war elephant, his armor battered and soaked in blood, he fought on, hurling javelins at the surrounding enemy even as his army collapsed around him. He suffered a severe wound to his right shoulder. Only when loss of blood made him faint did he allow his elephant to kneel and let him down. Alexander, observing the Indian king's incredible bravery, was awestruck. He rode out to meet Porus before his soldiers could kill him. Through an interpreter, Alexander asked the towering, blood-stained monarch, "How do you wish to be treated?" Porus, standing straight despite his wounds, looked down at the Greek conqueror and replied, "Treat me, Alexander, like a king." Alexander was impressed by the answer. "That I shall do for my own sake," he responded. "But what do you ask for your own sake?" Porus shook his head. Everything is contained in those words, like a king. Alexander not only spared Porus's life, but reinstated him as ruler of his domain, adding vast new territories to his realm. But the victory came at a devastating cost. Alexander's beloved warhorse, Bucephalus, who had carried him across Asia for over 20 years, died shortly after the battle from exhaustion and wounds. On the spot where his companion fell, Alexander founded the city of Bucephala. The Battle of the Hydaspes was a tactical masterpiece, but it proved to be a pyrrhic psychological victory. The sheer horror of facing war elephants combined with the endless monsoon mud and the prospect of facing even larger elephant armies along the Ganges broke the resolve of the Macedonian veterans. A few weeks later, at the Hyphasis River, Alexander's men mutinied. The conqueror of the world had beaten King Porus at the Hydaspes, but the battle had finally conquered the spirit of his invincible army.